Welcome to Twist of Revenge, a channel where we don't just tell stories. We hold up a mirror to the quiet moments in life that shape who we become. If stories about family, love, regret, and redemption speak to you, I invite you to stay. Subscribe if you haven't, because sometimes a single story can make us feel a little less alone. Today's story is titled, "My Dad Was the Only Parent Without a Gift at the School Ceremony, and I Was Ashamed Until the Principal Gave His Speech." Open Book Chapter 1, The Empty Hands. I was 13 the first time I remember feeling ashamed of my father. It was a Friday morning in early spring, the kind where the sky is a little too bright and the grass has just remembered how to be green again. Our school gym had been transformed, banners, balloons, folding chairs in perfect rows. It was Family Appreciation Day, some school-wide attempt at celebrating the parents who made our education possible. Everyone was buzzing about it. Kids had been planning for weeks, framing photos, painting thank you cards, collecting little trinkets for their moms and dads. Even the teachers were giddy, reminding us each morning to prepare something meaningful for the big day. And I had. Well, almost. The truth was, I didn't have much to give. Not because I didn't want to, but because back then I didn't think my dad would even show up. You see, my father wasn't like the other parents. He didn't wear suits. He didn't drive a clean car. He didn't work in an office. He had no degrees, no fancy job title to place neatly under his name. He worked with his hands, fixing things, building things, quiet things. And even though I loved him, I was beginning to realize that loving someone doesn't always keep you from feeling embarrassed by them. That morning, I clutched a wrinkled card I'd made the night before, one of those last-minute, guilty attempts to look like I'd remembered. It was folded in half, with barely legible words inside, written in marker that had bled through the page. I glanced around the gym as parents arrived, mothers in perfume and pearls, fathers with briefcases and fresh shaves. They held flower bouquets, colorful mugs, gift bags with glitter and ribbons. Then came my father. He entered quietly, like he always did. Hands calloused, shirt a bit worn at the collar, boots still carrying the scent of yesterday's dust. And most noticeably, he held nothing. No gift, no card, just his weathered hands. And I hated myself for it, but in that moment I wished he hadn't come at all. Kids turned, whispered. One girl nudged her friend and nodded toward him. I saw the corners of their mouths twitch with a smirk, and I, his daughter, looked away. Open Book Chapter 2. He waved at me from across the room, just a small, humble wave, barely more than a lift of his fingers. And for some reason that made it worse, because I didn't wave back. I just stared down at my shoes, pretending I hadn't seen him, pretending I was too busy organizing the half-crumpled card in my lap. I felt the heat crawl up the back of my neck. My ears rang. Every tiny sound around me, the chatter, the folding chairs scraping against the floor, the soft opening chords of the welcome song, felt amplified and cruel. When he finally sat down beside me, he offered a smile. "You look nice, sweetheart," he whispered. I didn't respond, not because I didn't hear him, but because the words lodged in my throat, tangled somewhere between shame and guilt. I couldn't look at him, not when Mrs. Ellis, sitting 2 rows ahead, was handing her husband a polished wooden plaque with "Best Dad Ever" engraved in cursive. Not when Benjamin Alvarez's parents had matching t-shirts that read, "Proud Parents of a Future Harvard Grad." Not when Rachel Dean's father, who was some kind of regional manager, had brought a giant bouquet of sunflowers and was already taking photos with half the staff. and not when my father sat beside me with nothing in his hands except his own. I caught sight of his fingers, thick, scarred, with tiny flecks of dried paint near the cuticles. One fingernail was split, the way it always got when he worked late on the weekends. He rubbed his thumb over a crack in the gymnasium bench as if testing the grain of the wood. "Nice job on these bleachers," he muttered quietly, almost to himself. They were starting to creak last fall, glad they got him fixed. He would know. He was the one who fixed them. But no one in that gym seemed to remember that. No one stood to applaud him for showing up after hours in the cold, patching up beams with his own tools. No one handed him a gift bag for climbing onto a half-rotted roof after last winter's storm. No one even knew, and neither did I, at least not then. I was too busy comparing his tired jeans to polished loafers, his work boots to leather dress shoes, his quiet presence to boisterous speeches and flashy tributes. Even the teachers seemed to overlook him. They called on certain parents by name. They read out thank you letters from students who'd written about how their mothers helped them study or how their dads coached the soccer team. One by one, parents were asked to stand and receive their child's small token of appreciation. And one by one, hands reached for flowers and boxes and photo frames. I clutched the card I had made for him, my half-hearted card, the one with uneven corners and smudged ink. I looked at it and then I slipped it under my chair. I couldn't bear to hand it to him. I told myself I'd give it later at home, but we both knew I wouldn't. He glanced over once, just briefly. I think he saw the card disappear, but he didn't ask. Instead, he looked straight ahead, folding his hands in his lap, nodding politely as the school counselor spoke about parental support and student success. He didn't fidget, didn't sigh, didn't shift in his seat. He simply was. And that was the thing about my father. He never demanded space. He never needed the spotlight. He just filled the quiet in a way most people never noticed. But that day I didn't see it. That day all I saw was that he was different, and I hated him a little for it. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that everything was about to change. Because a few minutes later, the principal stood and tapped the microphone. The room hushed. The air shifted. "I'd like to take a moment," he said, scanning the crowd, "to recognize someone who's never been honored in this gym before, but who's been a part of nearly every inch of it." And just like that, the room leaned forward. So did I. And next to me, my father finally lifted his head. Open Book Chapter 3. The principal cleared his throat, slowly, deliberately, like he understood that silence could speak louder than applause. "I know today is about celebrating the people who raise our students, guide them, and stand beside them in every season of their lives," he said, his voice steady but warm. "But before we move on, I'd like to share a story, one I believe every single person in this room deserves to hear." He paused, looked down at the note card in his hand, then back up again. "Years ago, before most of you students ever set foot in this building, this school faced something difficult. A storm had ripped through our district, left half our roof in ruins. Ceilings leaked. Classrooms were shut down. We didn't have enough funds for proper repairs. We were scrambling just to keep students safe and dry." He glanced around the room, letting the weight of his words settle. And while we waited for permits, budgets, red tape, someone showed up. A murmur spread through the parents. Kids shuffled in their seats. The principal smiled faintly. He didn't ask to be noticed. He didn't sign a contract or demand a fee. He just arrived with a toolbox and a ladder, and the kind of quiet resolve that says, "This place matters and I'm going to take care of it." I felt my throat tighten. he couldn't be talking about. He worked weekends, nights, sometimes alone under the rain, and when a few of our teachers offered to bring him dinner, he said no, he'd packed his own. Sandwiches and an apple, said he didn't want to be a bother. The laughter was soft, respectful. I didn't move. I could feel my father beside me, utterly still, hands still folded, his face unreadable, but I knew. He knew. The principal's voice softened. That same man was here during the fire, the one that started in the old science lab 6 years ago. I remembered that fire. I had been in 3rd grade. We'd all heard the alarms and run barefoot onto the front lawn. There'd been smoke, thick, black, terrifying. There was a student still inside, trapped, too much smoke. Everyone else was waiting on emergency crews, but this man, he ran in, found her, carried her out over his shoulder before the fire trucks even arrived. And when we asked him why he did it, he said. The principal chuckled lightly, shaking his head as he quoted, "That's someone's child. I just did what any father would do. Something broke open in my chest. It was him. He was talking about my dad." The principal reached for the mic with both hands now. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we recognize a man who has never asked for recognition. A man who has repaired more broken doors and leaky faucets and flickering lights in this school than any of us can count. But more than that, he's fixed things you can't see on blueprints. He's shown what it means to be present, dependable, humble, and quietly heroic." He turned and looked toward the back row, toward my father. "Mr. Samuel Hart," he said clearly, "would you please come up here?" The room turned as one. All eyes landed on my father. I froze. He looked at me, not with pride, not with smugness, but with something gentler, as if to say, "I told you. I was here all along." And then he stood, slowly, awkwardly, as though unsure if they'd really meant him. The applause started with the teachers, then the parents, then students, and then it was everyone clapping for my father with the cracked fingernails, the calloused palms, the empty hands. He walked to the front, still slightly hunched, like a man more used to lifting than being lifted up. And I, his daughter, sat there, blinking away tears I didn't want anyone to see, because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt like I was watching the strongest man in the room finally be seen. Open book chapter 4. He didn't say much when he reached the podium. Just stood there for a moment, blinking under the harsh gymnasium lights, adjusting the collar of his faded button-down shirt like it didn't quite belong in that kind of brightness. The applause slowly faded, but the silence that followed was full, not awkward, not empty. It felt like respect, like gratitude finally catching up to where it should have always been. My father looked out at the crowd, then down at the principal, then back at us. His eyes scanning faces not in judgment, but with the same gentle curiosity he always had when fixing something. Where does it hurt? Where can I help? He cleared his throat. I didn't expect this, he said simply. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It always had a way of doing that, even when he was just reading bedtime stories or telling me to be careful crossing the street. I've been around this school a long time, he continued, mostly after hours, fixing what's broken, patching what's worn down. Sometimes that's a leaky pipe, sometimes it's a door that won't close right. He paused, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, a hesitation, a weight. And sometimes, he said slowly, what's broken ain't in the building. I swallowed hard. My father never talked like that, not in front of people, not even at home. He turned slightly to face the students now. You kids are the reason I kept coming back. Some of you I've watched grow up since kindergarten. Some of you used to wave at me from the playground and ask me why I always had paint on my shoes. That drew a ripple of laughter. My classmates leaned forward, listening. He smiled just a little. I don't have much in the way of degrees or speeches. Never been one for big crowds, but I know what it means to care for something or someone, even when they don't know you're there. I stopped breathing. I believe, he said, and now he looked directly at me, that love doesn't always look like balloons or gift bags. Sometimes it's in the things nobody sees, the things you don't brag about, the things you just do. He paused, then nodded to the principal. Thank you for letting me be part of this place. It's been an honor. The gym erupted again, more applause, louder this time, standing ovation. My teachers, my classmates, parents I'd never even spoken to, all clapping, some even dabbing at their eyes, and me, I was crying, not the quiet kind you can hide behind your hair. The trembling lip, full body kind. The kind that rips through the armor you didn't know you were wearing. The kind that humbles you. When my father returned to his seat, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I reached under my chair, pulled out the wrinkled card I had tried to hide. I didn't even look at what I'd written inside. I just turned toward him, tears streaming down my face, and placed it in his hands. He looked at me, really looked, and he smiled. Not wide, not proud, just soft, forgiving. He folded the card carefully like it was something precious, then slipped it into the pocket over his heart. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because in that moment I realized something I had missed for most of my life. My father hadn't come to that ceremony empty-handed. He had walked in carrying everything that ever mattered. Open book chapter 5. We didn't talk much as we left the school. The crowd was still buzzing behind us, people shaking hands, parents gathering in clusters to talk about summer plans, teachers straightening folding chairs, but we slipped out quietly, the same way he had entered. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and everything felt strangely still, like the world had tilted just a few degrees and hadn't settled yet. My father walked beside me, his hands in his jacket pockets, his steps slow and measured. I kept glancing up at him. There was so much I wanted to say, and none of the words seemed right. I'm sorry. You were amazing. I didn't know. But all of them felt small, like trying to repay a lifetime with a sentence. So I said nothing. We passed the corner store where he always used to stop and buy me orange soda after school. The old man behind the counter waved. My dad waved back. He knew everyone in our neighborhood, and everyone knew him, just not the way I knew him now, or rather the way I was starting to. When we turned onto our street, I finally spoke. Dad, I didn't know you were the one who fixed the roof. He kept his eyes ahead. Didn't matter if people knew, long as it didn't leak. I bit the inside of my cheek. But the fire, you never told me you ran in there, you never told me any of that. He shrugged, as if running into a burning building was no more remarkable than fixing a fence. I'm not much for stories, he said, and some things you just do, you don't talk about. We walked in silence again. My backpack bounced lightly against my hip. I thought about all the stories he had never told, all the quiet mornings he left before I woke up, the nights he came home smelling of sawdust and oil. I thought about the shoes he never replaced so I could have new ones for the start of the school year. I thought about the time I got sick and missed a field trip, and how, weeks later, he drove me to the same museum on his only day off, pretending it was better that way. I thought about how many times I had looked through him instead of at him. At our porch steps, he paused and looked down at me. You were embarrassed, he said, not accusing, just honest. I opened my mouth to deny it, to say no, but the truth hung between us like a weight too big to lift. I nodded. I was. He nodded too, like he'd already known and had forgiven me long before I'd admitted it. Sometimes, he said, it takes a while to see what's right in front of you. I looked up at him, his tired eyes, his weathered face, the small ink stain on his shirt pocket where he'd tucked my card, and I saw him. I really saw him, not as the man who didn't bring a gift, but the man who had already given everything. We stood on the porch for a moment longer before he opened the door and stepped inside, letting the screen creak behind him. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel smaller next to him. I felt proud. Open book chapter 6. The next Monday at school, something was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. No one threw me a party or stuck a local hero's daughter banner above my locker. But it was there, in the glances, in the pauses, in the way people now said my last name with just a little more weight behind it. Hey, is your dad the one who? Man, I didn't know he worked here that long. I heard he saved someone from that fire. Was that real? Even the teachers looked at me differently, like they were seeing something that had been there all along but hadn't registered until someone had flipped a light switch. It was the first time I realized reputation doesn't always come from speaking loudly. Sometimes it comes from living quietly with consistency, with honor, with purpose. But it wasn't their looks that mattered. It was mine, because for the first time I didn't duck my head in the hallway. I didn't sit at the back of the classroom and hope to blend in. I started lifting my chin, making eye contact. Not because I was suddenly popular, but because I was no longer hiding from myself. I carried something new with me, something I hadn't known I was missing: dignity. At home, things weren't loud either. My dad didn't mention the ceremony once. He didn't hang the thank you plaque on the wall or reread the card I gave him aloud. He just folded his work shirt like always, ironed it on Sunday night, and packed his lunch the next morning. But I noticed things. He walked a little taller when we passed the school fence. He whistled again while making his morning coffee. And I started waking up earlier. Sometimes I'd wander into the kitchen before sunrise just to sit beside him as he sipped his drink and looked out the window. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Sometimes I'd ask questions. Was it scary? I asked once about the fire. He shrugged. Not really, not when you know someone's in trouble. Another time, I asked, why didn't you ever tell me all the stuff you did for the school? He sipped his coffee, then looked at me over the rim of the mug. Would you have listened? He asked, and I knew the answer. I wouldn't have. I'd have rolled my eyes, called it dad stuff, tuned him out. Because the truth is, we don't always see the people who raise us, not until someone else reminds us to look. That week, I started volunteering after school, helping organize supplies in the janitor's closet, cleaning up the art room, just little things. My friends asked why. I said, because my dad would. And I think that was the moment I knew I wasn't just proud of him. I wanted to be like him. Open book chapter 7. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of afternoon where the clouds hung low and heavy, like they weren't sure whether to rain or not. I'd stayed late at school to help Mrs. Lanning inventory the old science lab, boxes of dusty microscopes and half-dried glue sticks no one had touched in years. As I left the side building and headed down the narrow path that led past the back lot, I saw him. My father. He was crouched near the dumpster, tools spread out beside him on a blue tarp that looked more duct tape than fabric. His shirt was half untucked and there was a smudge of oil on his cheekbone. One of the maintenance carts had a broken axle and he was trying to fix the wheel before the next day's delivery. Nothing heroic, nothing headline-worthy. But then I saw what stopped him. A boy, maybe in first or second grade, Small, thin, with a backpack twice his size and one untied sneaker dragging like it had given up halfway through the day. He stood by the chain-link fence, trying to reach a stray soccer ball that had rolled under the gate. It was just out of his grasp, caught on a slope. My dad noticed. He set down his wrench, walked over, and instead of just grabbing the ball and handing it back, he knelt. He spoke to the boy quietly, gently. I couldn't hear what he said, but the boy nodded. My father picked up the ball and rolled it into the kid's arms like a bowling ball in slow motion. The kid beamed. They talked for another minute, and then my dad bent down and tied the boy's loose shoelace. Double knotted it the way he always did mine when I was little, like he was tucking safety into every loop. The boy gave him a hug, then ran off toward the parking lot where a tired-looking woman was waiting near a minivan. And my dad. He turned back, wiped his hands on a rag, and returned to the broken axle like nothing had happened, like no one had seen, but I had. And for the first time, I realized my father was never just fixing buildings. He was mending the soft spaces between people, the ones that tear when life gets too hard or when we grow up too fast and forget to look behind us. That night at dinner, I asked him about the boy. "Oh, that little guy," he said, chewing. "His name's Illy. He likes dinosaurs and hates spelling tests." "You know all that from one conversation." He shrugged. "You'd be surprised what people tell you when you actually listen." I set down my fork and just watched him, not for what he said, but for what he didn't say. The way he looked up when I didn't expect him to. The way he asked how my day was but didn't press if I didn't feel like sharing. The way he sat across from me, not as a man waiting to be praised but just being there. That's when it really clicked. My father had never needed an audience. He didn't fix things to be thanked. He fixed them because they needed fixing. He showed up, not for credit, but because showing up was how he loved. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of greatness we should be teaching in schools. Not just the kind that stands on a podium, but the kind that kneels down to tie a child's shoe. Open Book Chapter 8. It was in the cafeteria the day after I saw my dad help the little boy. I was standing in line with my tray, lukewarm pasta, a bruised apple chocolate milk carton sweating in my hand when I heard them behind me. 2 girls, seniors. I didn't know them well, the kind of people who always walked like they owned the hallway, who spoke like the world was just waiting for them to weigh in. "I heard he's just the janitor or something," one of them said. She didn't say his name, but I knew my father. "Yeah," the other chimed in, laughing softly. "And didn't he get some, like, pity award at the assembly? I mean, come on, that was so random." A beat passed, and then the first girl said it, with a smirk in her voice. Not loud, just sharp enough. "Can't imagine having a dad like that. I'd die of embarrassment." My stomach tightened. The old me, the me from just a few weeks ago, would have said nothing, would have stared at my tray, waited for the moment to pass, told myself they didn't mean harm, swallowed it like spoiled milk. But I wasn't that version of me anymore. I turned, and I said calmly, clearly, "You don't know him." They blinked, startled. One of them laughed nervously. "Sorry, what?" I took a breath. "You said you'd be embarrassed, but I watched him run into a burning building to save a child. I've seen him stay up until midnight fixing leaks so kids could have class the next morning. He knows the name of every custodian, every crossing guard, every kid who sits alone at lunch. So yeah, he's not a CEO or a lawyer." I looked her straight in the eye. "He's better." Their faces shifted. That uncomfortable expression people get when they realize they've crossed a line but don't want to admit it. One of them muttered something, "Whatever," and turned away. The other followed, but I didn't care. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't burning with humiliation or shame. I felt steady, planted, like my father had passed some invisible part of his strength into me, and for the first time I'd used it. I sat down alone that day. No one joined me, and that was fine, because I sat tall. I thought of all the times he stood alone, not needing anyone to clap, not needing to be liked, just needing to do what was right. And maybe that's how it starts. Maybe we become like the people we admire by standing in their shadows long enough to realize it's not darkness, it's shelter. That night at home, I told him what happened. He was peeling potatoes for dinner, humming some old Motown tune. When I finished the story, he paused, didn't look up right away. Then he said, "You stood up for someone. That's more than a lot of adults know how to do." I shook my head. I just told them the truth. He smiled, eyes still on the potato. That's the hardest part. And he went back to peeling, slow and steady, like it was just another day. But I saw his shoulders rise just barely, the way they do when something heavy starts to lift. Open book chapter 9. It started with the little things. A hallway mural that had been peeling for months, suddenly painted over, bright and new. A leaky fountain by the gym, repaired, running clean again. A bench outside the library, sandpapered smooth and coated with fresh varnish. And for once people noticed, not because the work was new. He had been doing it for years, but because the principal's speech had opened everyone's eyes, as if someone had pulled back a curtain and said, "Look closer. See what's been here all along." Teachers began stopping him in the halls. "Thank you, Mr. Hart." Parents waved as they dropped off their kids. Even students, the same ones who once barely glanced his way, now called out greetings. "Hey, Mr. H. Morning, sir." And he always responded the same way, a nod, a half smile, sometimes a joke, never basking, never drawing it out. I noticed how natural it was for him, like he'd been building a reputation brick by brick, day by day, never needing applause, but now, finally, the building stood tall enough for everyone to see. One afternoon, I stayed late again, waiting for him to finish patching a cracked window frame in the cafeteria. I wandered to the bulletin board outside the office, where the staff usually posted flyers for tutoring, bake sales, lost and found notices. Pinned in the center was something new, a simple sheet of paper. "In gratitude to Mr. Samuel Hart, whose dedication reminds us that true strength is quiet and true service is love in action." I read it twice. My chest tightened. Behind me a voice said, "He saved me, you know." I turned. A girl I barely knew, older than me, maybe a junior, stood there clutching a binder. "The fire," she said, her eyes lowering. I was the one he carried out. I didn't know what to say. She nodded once, almost to herself. I don't remember much, just the smoke and the heat, but I remember his voice. He kept saying, "You're safe, I've got you." She walked away before I could reply. I stood there, staring at the paper on the board, the echo of her words still in my ears. That was when I understood. My father wasn't just my story. He wasn't just the man I had been too embarrassed to claim. He belonged to all of them too. The students who drank from the fountains he fixed, the kids who sat on the benches he built, the girl he pulled from the flames. His fingerprints were everywhere, and for the first time I felt something bigger than pride. I felt legacy. Open book chapter 10. It was the Spring Festival, an annual tradition our town had held for as long as anyone could remember. Booths lined the park with paper lanterns strung from tree to tree, the smell of grilled corn and kettle popcorn drifting in the air. Children darted between hay bales and balloon stands, their laughter echoing above the hum of conversation. I hadn't planned on going, but my father insisted. "It's good to be among neighbors," he said, pressing his cap low against the evening sun. When we arrived, he blended in the way he always did, stopping to shake hands with the local grocer, asking about the bus driver's bad knee, complimenting the high school band warming up on stage. No one would have guessed that tonight he wasn't just a face in the crowd. Halfway through, the mayor took the microphone on the main stage. Every year, she began, we gather not just to celebrate the season, but to honor the people who make this town what it is. People whose work often goes unseen, but whose impact touches us all. The crowd shifted, quieting. I felt a flicker of recognition deep in my chest. This year, the mayor continued, her voice ringing clear across the park. We want to recognize a man who has given more than most of us realize. He has patched our schools, protected our children, and reminded us that true service asks for nothing in return. A murmur rippled through the audience, and then she said it. Please join me in honoring Mr. Samuel Hart. The spotlight swept the crowd, landing on us. My father froze, his hand still in his pocket, as though he'd been caught doing something he wasn't supposed to. Dad, I whispered, nudging him. People began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until it was a rolling wave of sound that filled the night air. Strangers, neighbors, classmates, faces turned toward him with admiration instead of dismissal. My father shifted, uncomfortable, but he walked. He climbed the wooden steps to the stage. His boots scuffed against the planks. The mayor handed him a plaque, but it was her words that mattered. This man is more than a worker. He is more than a father. He is the reason a generation of children felt safe walking into school each day. He is the man who rushed into fire when others waited for help. He is the one who, brick by brick, nail by nail, made our community whole again. I blinked hard, trying to steady my breath. The words struck me deeper than I expected, because I knew they weren't just honoring him. They were exposing the truth I had been blind to for so long. The crowd stood, applauding. Some shouted his name, and yet he only bowed his head slightly, gripping the plaque as if it weighed more than gold. When the noise softened, he leaned into the microphone. I don't have much to say, he began, his voice rough but steady. I've only ever done what needed to be done. Roofs don't fix themselves. Fires don't wait. Kids need a place where they can feel safe, and if I could help build that, then I've done my part. He glanced down at me, just for a second, but it was enough. And the truth is, he added, I didn't do any of it alone. Every nail I hammered, every window I patched, it was for you, for all of you. This community raised me as much as I've served it, so if you're clapping, clap for yourselves too. The applause roared again, louder than before, and I, standing there at the foot of the stage, felt something I had never felt so fiercely in my life. Pride that burned away every ounce of shame. Because in that moment, my father wasn't just my father. He was the heart of our town. Open Book Chapter 11. That night after the festival, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of applause in my ears. The image of my father on that stage, his shoulders hunched, his words simple, his eyes searching for no spotlight but finding it anyway, wouldn't leave me. And then my mind drifted back to the fire. I was 8. It had been a Tuesday morning, I think ordinary until it wasn't. We'd been in the science lab learning about magnets. I remember the sudden smell, sharp and chemical, the teacher's voice rising, urgent. Then the alarm, shrill, piercing, rattling in my chest. We'd rushed into the hallway, kids stumbling, some crying. I remember my shoes squeaking on the polished floor as we poured toward the front lawn. And then the smoke. Black, thick, curling up toward the ceiling, my throat burning, the world shrinking into confusion and sirens. I didn't see him go in, But I remembered the moment everyone gasped. The front doors swung open, and through the haze emerged a figure carrying someone. A girl coughing, her arms limp around his shoulders. I hadn't known it was him. Not then. To me, it was just a man. Heroes don't have names when you're 8. They're just shadows against fire, larger than life, impossible to understand. But now I knew. It was his hands that had pushed through the heat, his boots that had crunched against shattered glass, his voice that had said, "You're safe, I've got you." And all these years, he never mentioned it, not once at the dinner table, not in passing, not in some story told for my benefit. He had carried a life out of the fire and then carried on with his own as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And I, his daughter, had sat beside him for years thinking he was less than the other fathers, thinking the absence of gifts or titles or wealth meant he had nothing. How blind I had been. Tears slid down my cheeks, soaking the pillow, not from guilt exactly, but from the sharp ache of finally seeing clearly, of realizing that my father had been the bravest man I'd ever known, and I hadn't even had the eyes to recognize it. The next morning I found him in the kitchen, sitting with his coffee, the newspaper folded neatly beside his cup. He looked up when I entered, raising his eyebrows at my red eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. I kept thinking about the fire. He didn't flinch, just nodded slowly like he'd been waiting for this. "You were there," I whispered. He sipped his coffee, set it down. "Yes," he said quietly, "I was there." I swallowed hard. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He leaned back, folding his arms, not defensive, not distant, just thoughtful. "Because it wasn't about me," he said. "It was about her, about making sure she got to grow up, go to prom, fall in love, live her life. That's the story that mattered, not who carried her out." His words settled in the room like dust after a storm, soft, unshakable, eternal. And I understood. My father didn't measure his life in recognition. He measured it in lives touched, roofs mended, hearts steadied. And maybe that was why the world had clapped so hard at the festival, because deep down people know the quietest hands are often the strongest. Open Book Chapter 12. The stories began to find me, not because I asked for them, because I didn't. But once the festival speech had named him aloud, it was as if a door had been opened, and through it people began to share pieces of him I had never known. The first came from Mrs. Jensen, the librarian. I was checking out a book when she leaned across the counter and said softly, "You know, your father once built those shelves over there." She pointed to the far wall where the tall oak cases stood. The district wouldn't fund new ones and the old ones were splitting. He brought in reclaimed wood, sanded it himself, stained it until it gleamed, stayed here 3 nights straight working until dawn. I offered to pay him. He refused. The second came from a boy in my math class. He was quiet, kept to himself. After class, he tugged at my sleeve. "Your dad, he gave me my first baseball glove," he whispered. Said it was his son's, but he didn't have a son who played. He saw me practicing with a bare hand and said no kid should go without. I didn't even know my father owned a baseball glove. And then there was the letter. It arrived in our mailbox one Saturday morning, tucked between grocery ads and electric bills. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting uneven. "Mr. Hart, you don't know me well. Years ago, I was one of the kids who stayed after school when my mom couldn't pick me up. You probably don't even remember. But one night, I was scared to walk home in the dark. You walked with me. You told me that the world is less scary when someone walks beside you. I'm in college now, but I never forgot that night. Thank you." I held the paper in my hands for a long time, reading it again and again. My father was in the garage fixing the hinge on the side door. I thought about running out to show him, but something stopped me. Because the truth was, he didn't need to see it. He didn't need proof that his life had mattered. He wasn't looking for evidence of impact, but I did. And each story, each memory, each quiet testimony stitched together a portrait more powerful than any plaque or stage could offer. The man I had once wished would stay invisible was becoming unforgettable. That night at dinner, I looked at him differently. The way his hands moved as he sliced bread, the way he paused to let me speak, the way he reached for the salt, but only after asking if I wanted it first. Everything about him was steady, intentional, present. And I realized maybe greatness doesn't announce itself. Maybe it simply shows up over and over, until the world has no choice but to notice. Open Book Chapter 13. The ceremony was held in the gym again. It wasn't family day this time or a festival, it was something else. A gathering the principal himself had called a celebration of service. Students filled the bleachers, parents crowded the back rows, teachers lined the stage. A brass band polished their instruments until they gleamed. And at the center of it all, my father. He sat near the aisle, shifting in his seat, tugging at the sleeve of his worn shirt like it was too fine a fabric for him. He looked as though he might stand up and slip out the side door at any moment, as if recognition was heavier than the work he'd spent years doing. But the principal wouldn't let that happen. When the microphone crackled to life, the entire gym hushed. Today, the principal began. We honor someone who has given more to this school than anyone else in this room, including myself. For decades, he has walked these halls. He has patched our roofs, fixed our benches, painted our walls, and repaired the things we often didn't even notice were broken. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. And yet, because of him, we've all had more than we deserved: safety, shelter, and care. The applause rose, but he raised his hand for quiet. There's one story I want you all to remember, the principal continued. Years ago, when fire broke out in this very building, chaos consumed us. Smoke filled the air. Fear gripped us. And before the fire department even arrived, one man ran back inside, not for glory, not for reward, but because he heard a child's cry. The gym fell silent. You could hear the band instruments settling in their cases, the shuffle of sneakers on the polished floor. He carried her out, the principal said. He saved her life, and he never told the story himself, because that's who he is, quiet, humble. A man who does what's right not for applause but because it is right. Then he turned toward my father. Mr. Hart, this school is not just bricks and mortar, it is people. And you, sir, have been its keeper, its guardian, its quiet hero. The principal gestured and the band began to play, a steady, swelling hymn that made the air itself tremble. Please stand, he said, his voice breaking with emotion, and join me in recognizing the man who has given us more than we can ever repay, Mr. Samuel Hart. And they did. Every student, every teacher, every parent. The bleachers thundered with applause. Feet stomped the floor in rhythm. Hands clapped until they burned. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father lifted not by his own quiet strength, but by the gratitude of everyone he had ever served. I stood too, clapping, crying, my throat tight, my heart pounding, because at last the world saw what I had almost missed. The man I once thought empty-handed had been carrying us all along. Open Book Chapter 14. When the ceremony ended, the gym was still echoing. Even as the crowd began to file out, the applause seemed to linger in the walls, as if the building itself had decided to hold it. I didn't wait. Before anyone could stop me, I pushed past the rows of students and ran down the steps, weaving between folding chairs until I reached him. He was still standing by the stage, holding the plaque they'd given him. Nothing fancy, just polished wood and a brass plate with his name. He looked down at it like he wasn't sure what to do, like he might hand it back. "Dad." The word burst out of me louder than I intended. Heads turned, but I didn't care. I threw my arms around him. For a second he stiffened, awkward in the way men who aren't used to attention always are. But then his hands came up, rough and strong, wrapping around me. He held me close, and in his chest I felt the steady beat of a man who never rushed, never wavered, never stopped showing up. Tears slid down my cheeks. Hot, unstoppable. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Dad." He leaned back just enough to see my face. His eyes were wet too, but his expression was soft, gentle in a way that broke me even more. "For what?" he asked. For being ashamed, for not seeing you. For," my words tangled, spilling out like knots finally untied. "For thinking you had nothing to give when you've given me everything." He shook his head. "No, sweetheart, you don't owe me an apology. You were just a kid. Kids don't always see the whole picture. They're not supposed to. But I hurt you." He smiled, a small, tired smile, but real. "You can't hurt me by not knowing who I am," he said. "You can only hurt yourself, and now you see that's enough." I pressed my face against his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt. The gym had emptied almost completely by then. Chairs scraped, doors closed, the last notes of the band fading into silence. But for me, the world had narrowed to this. My father, my tears, his arms, his voice. And in that moment, I realized something I would carry forever. I hadn't just been his daughter. I had been his blind spot. And now, finally, my eyes were open. Open book chapter 15. We walked home in silence that night. The plaque was tucked under his arm as casually as if it were a sack of groceries. Street lamps cast halos of light on the pavement, and our shadows stretched long behind us, walking together like companions who had finally caught up to each other. When we reached the porch, he paused, rested the plaque on the railing, looked out at the street as if he were searching for something in the dark. "Funny thing about honors," he said at last. His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "They feel heavy when you're holding them, but in the morning they don't keep the lights on. They don't fix a broken door. They don't hug you when you're hurting." He turned toward me, his eyes soft. "Legacy isn't wood and brass, sweetheart. It isn't what hangs on a wall." He tapped his chest with one finger. "It's here, in the people you've helped. In the moments no one saw, but you did anyway. That's what lasts." I swallowed, the words pressing against my throat. He picked up the plaque again, studied it a moment, then smiled wryly. "Don't get me wrong, it's nice. But if tomorrow this thing disappeared, nothing about my life would change. Not one bit." I tilted my head. "Then what matters to you?" He slipped the plaque under his arm again and opened the door. But before stepping inside, he looked at me with an expression I'd never forget. "You, always you." The words landed with a weight deeper than any speech. And I realized, the greatest thing my father had ever built wasn't the repaired roof, the fixed fountain, or the shelves in the library. It was me. All those years, while I was wishing for someone wealthier, flashier, more admired, he had been quietly shaping me, teaching me strength not by lecture but by example, teaching me love not through gifts but through presence. And for the first time I wanted to be more than his daughter. I wanted to be his legacy. Open book chapter 16. Years have passed since that day in the gym. I am grown now, older, carrying a life of my own. And yet, whenever I walk through a schoolyard or pass the sound of children's laughter, I think of him, my father, The man who walked into ceremonies with empty hands, but who carried more weight than anyone knew. The man who measured his worth not by what he owned, but by what he gave. The man who showed me that love is not loud but steady, that it does not need an audience to be real. He's gone now. The house is quiet without his boots at the door, without the low hum of his voice in the mornings, but I feel him everywhere. In the shelves of my home, sturdy and simple. In the way I tie my child's shoelaces, double knotted, just like he used to. In the way I notice the small things people overlook and choose to care anyway. He taught me that legacy is not applause, nor plaques, nor speeches. Legacy is what lives on in the people you've touched, the love you've left behind. And though the world may forget the name on a brass plate, I will never forget the man who held nothing in his hands, yet gave me everything. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I wish you health, peace, and a family that reminds you every single day that love is the greatest legacy of all. May you hold your loved ones close tonight, and may you never be ashamed of the hands that raised you.